Well, good afternoon, everybody. I can feel a buzz of excitement because we've come to a high point in the 2 days of our meeting. Just before we start, just one brief housekeeping note. Excuse me. For the dinner tonight, it's just for people who are registered, and I apologise for people who wanted to get tickets at the last minute. We've had to book and plan our seats in advance with the caterer. It's going to be in the Air New Zealand foyer on level 5, starting at 7 p.m. For a 7:30 meal. Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is a very special event for us, the Ian Prior Oration. And at Robert's request, we're going to do it slightly different to the format in the past. He would very much like to have a question and discussion time at the end of his presentation. And so it's going to be slightly different to how it's been run usually. If I go back to the beginning of this year, when we were thinking who should present this oration, it was the unanimous decision of the organising committee to ask Robert to deliver this. And we're grateful, Robert, that you've actually accepted this, our invitation. And I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Ruth Bonita at the presentation, at the oration, because Ruth has been Robert's partner both in epidemiology and also in life. Robert Bigelhold trained in medicine, cardiology, epidemiology and public health, and was Professor of Community Health at the University of Auckland from 1988 to 1999. He worked at the WHO Geneva between 2001 and 2007, during which time, part of that time, he was Director of the WHO Department of Chronic Disease and Health Promotion. He is now an independent global public health practitioner with a focus on the global prevention and control of non-communicable diseases, especially tobacco control. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Auckland and also chairs the Lancet NCD Action Group. There have been many distinguished epidemiologists who have delivered the Ian Prior Oration, but none can claim the same personal and working relationship that Robert had with Ian Prior. And that's why this oration will be very special. The title of Robert's oration is Epidemiology and Politics, Lessons from Ian Prior's Battles. Robert, we welcome and listen to your presentation.
Kia ora tātou. Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you to the program committee for inviting me to give this oration. I'm deeply honoured to be able to do this today. Ian was my first and my main mentor, and I still have great gratitude to Ian. Over 45 years ago, he set me on my epidemiological public health pathway. It's been a wonderful journey, and I have throughout this journey been inspired, engaged by Ian. So thank you for the invitation. Ian was without doubt the founder of modern epidemiology in New Zealand. He wasn't the first epidemiologist. Perhaps that honour goes to Charles Smirke, who was a dentist, then a medically qualified public health specialist, Professor of Public Health, University of Otago, Dunedin. And in the 1920s, Horace Smirke did some very nice epidemiological studies of thyroid disorders. And from those studies came iodisation of salt in New Zealand. So New Zealand has a very fine tradition of applying epidemiology to public health and to health issues, going back to Charles Smirke and perhaps even further. Ian didn't associate directly with Charles Smirke, but he followed on that tradition. And Ian's contributions to health policy in New Zealand, to public life in New Zealand more generally, have been outstanding and unrivaled by any subsequent epidemiologist in New Zealand. So I'm telling 3 stories today. The story about Ian, about his life, about his work, his contributions to epidemiology, to policy, and social welfare in New Zealand and beyond. Story number 1. As I've been thinking about Ian, I realise that I have things to say about myself as well, which I will keep to a minimum. But I've been thinking a lot about my career development, the influence that Ian has had on me, and some of the issues that I share in common with Ian and things that I don't share in common with Ian. So that's the second story. And the third story, and perhaps the story that you've come to hear, is our story. Our story about epidemiology and policy. How do we translate the evidence we have into health policy to improve the health of all New Zealanders, of all Australians, of all Vietnamese? And that's going to be the third part of this presentation. Robert said I'm breaking tradition by actually encouraging questions at the end. Well, I hope that's acceptable to this audience in the age of the internet. I'm sure it is. I'm going to do some other things a little differently too. So I hope you'll accept the flow as it goes. So this is Ian Prior, 1923-2009. And he came equipped, probably from birth, with many pithy sayings, all of which he recorded in his little black book, something like this. And he said repeatedly, "To whom much is given, much is expected." And he got this from, I believe, his father, his mother, strong Methodist upbringing. His father was a GP in Masterton, a small town north of Wellington. Ian's brother Owen took over the family practice. Owen's son Simon took over the family practice. There's been a Prior practicing general practice in Masterton for over 100 years. I imagine that's unrivaled in New Zealand, and who knows about Australia. His father was a family practitioner, delivered babies at home, not Ian. Ian was delivered in the upstairs room, presumably by a midwife, 1923. His father and his mother, to a lesser extent, were strong supporters of the temperance movement. Well, I think I'm pleased to say that even from an early age, Ian showed no desire to follow that temperance set of habits. And there's a wonderful picture of Ian in a book I'm going to refer to shortly. He and 4 of his medical student colleagues, when they were members of the Otago University Medical Corps during the Second World War, all sitting outside in a very relaxed posture, all smoking. That wouldn't, of course, happen these days. So Ian was born in 1923. He decided very early on to go to medical school. Only one medical school in those days, in Dunedin. He graduated in 1945 at the age of 22. He had gone straight from high school to medical school. But I think he would agree that the key event of his medical school career was a ride on a tram. And on that tram in 1943, he saw Elizabeth, the woman who was 3 years later to agree, finally, to marry him. And I am absolutely confident that the personal and the supportive relationship that they had together is responsible for much of what Ian was able to achieve in his epidemiological life and also in his many other spheres of interest. And Robert, you kindly mentioned Ruth, and there's a parallel in my life immediately. I didn't meet Ruth on a tram, but it was close. She was running along the gangplank, running along the wharf, trying to reach the gangplank to take us on a boat to China in 1966. Fortunately, she was able to run fast enough to make the boat. So, of course, personal relationships, family supports go back a long way. So Ian graduated in 1946, came to Wellington, worked at Silverstream Hospital, and then did registrar jobs in Wellington and New Plymouth. And in 1953, he went overseas he then went overseas and trained in cardiology at Leeds Hospital and in National Heart Hospital in London, and came back to Wellington 1943 as a medical registrar, a senior registrar, and then as a junior physician. In 1957, he had a short sabbatical supported by the Fulbright Foundation in Boston. Probably a key period in his life. He learnt more cardiology. Even more importantly, he met Bernard Lown. And Bernard Lown, later on, with a Russian cardiologist, Shazov, established International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. And I'm going to come back to that later. Ian returned to Wellington in 1959 as a junior physician, disappointed not to have received the position as head of cardiology at Wellington Hospital. That was taken by Dr. Guy Hallwright. And this is an aside. Dr. Guy Hallwright was the cardiologist in Wellington who looked after my father when he became very ill in the 1960s and died, I think, prematurely from cardiovascular disease, and I would say by modern standards, not well treated. Anyhow, Ian was working for... So I have a thing about Hallwright as well. And in 1959, the dean of the medical school in Dunedin decided that in Wellington and Auckland and then in Christchurch there would be an outpost of the Dunedin Medical School, and a medical unit was established in Wellington, and Ian became the director of the medical unit. And of course this medical unit is the forerunner of the Wellington Medical School of the Otago University. And of course we have such a wonderful representation from that medical school at this meeting. Not to mention the wonderful representation, Robert, from Auckland as well. Increasingly, Ian found clinical medicine to be not completely satisfactory, and he became increasingly interested in the health of populations. In 1962, in New Zealand, was published an official government report by the statistician Richard Rhodes comparing standards of health amongst so-called European and Maori. And this was the first time an official document had demonstrated the much higher rates of death, all causes, in Maori as compared with Pākehā, as compared with Europeans. And this tickled Ian's fancy. And Richard Rose, the government statistician, to his great credit, called for population-based studies to investigate this inequality, what we might now call this inequity. And Ian leapt at the chance. And he began his epidemiological studies in the early 1960s. Epidemiological studies which were innovative at the time. Perhaps through the retrospect we would agree that they had methodological faults, but he got started. And he studied Maori populations in Ruatahuna, in Tiki-Tiki, and in Rotorua, and then a contrasting European population in Carterton, very close to Masterton, presumably chosen for that reason. And as he was getting started, he made some wonderful decisions to engage with local Maori communities. And he developed a very close relationship with John Rangihau, who from Tuhoe, from Ruatahuna, who was a trainee social worker being taught by John McCleary at the Victoria University in Wellington. And John Rangihau took Ian to Ruatahuna and said, "You sit there and you say nothing." And there was lots of talk about what this proposal was going to do and what, above all, it might contribute to the health of the people of Ruatahuna. And that set Ian on the path of being engaged with communities. It also set Ian on the path, uniquely, I think, at that time, for studying whole populations, not just middle-aged white men between the ages of 45 and 69, as was the case in many other epidemiological studies at that time. And there were other innovative aspects of Ian's work: engagement with the communities, population-based, and also interdisciplinary. A feature of Ian's work has been the engagement of anthropologists, sociologists, social workers, and so forth. Something, of course, we recognise the importance of now. And those studies in Maori communities and the Pākehā community of Carterton led to his interest in the Pacific. And this is where I come into the story. Again, my parents in 1935, before I was born, you will be pleased to hear, had spent 9 months on the island of Pukapuka, a northern Cook atoll. We heard on Monday from Sir Mason Dury about Sir Peter Buck. Well, Sir Peter Buck sent my parents to Pukapuka to do the ethnography of Pukapuka. So they spent 9 months there and had a wonderful time for lots of reasons, and wrote some very, very interesting descriptions of their work, of their life, of their language, of their social characteristics. So when Ian started to think about going to Pukapuka, he went there in 1964, he came to visit with us. We lived in Karori too. And that's when I first met Ian Pryor, probably in 1964, 63. Can't say he resonated greatly, but this idea of travelling to Pacific Islands for health reasons clearly did resonate. So 64, he was in Rarotonga, the Cook Islands, also in Pukapuka. And then there were some natural events in Tokelau, another small island group 500 kilometres north of Samoa, very close actually to Tokelau. There was a hurricane in 1966. There were concerns about population overload. There were issues about storm surges and destruction of low-lying atolls and villages around these atolls. So there was a movement by the New Zealand government to bring Tokelauans to New Zealand, to Porirua, to Auckland, and for some reason, to Dunedin. There had been a small number of Tokelauans in New Zealand before that, mostly young women brought down to serve as domestic servants, you might say. And there'd been some who had gone from Tokelau to Samoa, but when Samoa became independent in 1962, they were kindly asked to move on to New Zealand. So there were some Tokelauans in New Zealand in the mid-1960s, but most were still there, but under threat from pressure and beginning to migrate from New Zealand. So in 1968 began the Tokelau Island Migrant Study, so-called, with studies at 3 periods of time in Tokelau and then follow-up studies in New Zealand, examining the question as to what happens to people, populations, when they move from one more or less traditional environment to the environment characteristic of a high-income countries. And of course, from many respects, the impact is devastating. So, just taking a little segue, so we've got Ian and Tokelau, so where am I? In 1968 I graduated from medical school, and for my first year house surgeon job in Wellington I worked for Ian. And that was a very interesting experience, and I probably learnt some medicine. Although I have to say, I was thinking about this morning, most of the practical medicine I ever learnt was in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Unfortunately, the medicine I learnt there has never been of any use to any other location that I've applied it to. And Ruth and I had a wonderful 3-month period, actually, when I was a medical student in Mount Hagen and Wapanamanda. So I was exposed to Ian at that point in my life, and he was obviously interested in me following on and building an epidemiological career. And after I had graduated, Ian picked up the phone one day, actually turned out to be middle of the night in London, rang a professor of medicine at Guy's Hospital, John Butterfield, and said, could he find me a job? I don't know what John Butterfield owed Ian prior, but they'd met. John Butterfield had been out here talking about diabetes a couple of years earlier, and I ended up with Ruth at Guy's Hospital in 1960 as a registrar, totally ill-equipped for the task, but encouraged by Ian, I became a specialist physician by passing the MRCP, membership of the Royal College of Physicians. And I'm going to tell you how I did that for those of you who still might have an interest in becoming a qualified physician. Ruth and I retired to the countryside for 3 weeks, and I read Harrison's Principles of Medicine from cover to cover. And I supplemented that by clinical medicine given to me for the fee of £200 by Papworth, who ran courses on how to pass the clinical exams. So I had all of the knowledge. I'd been a very studious medical student, so I had all of that knowledge with me. Then I had the knowledge from reading Harrison's, and then I had the clinical experience from several evenings of being told, now, if you get this woman who's got ginger hair and is wearing an earring, she will have a wonderful mitral stenosis murmur. For some reason, a city as large as London, there was not sufficient clinical material to vary. I guess they just rang these same people time and time again, and presumably they gave them a cup of tea and a biscuit and 10 quid or something. So it worked. I passed. I became a fully fledged physician, totally inexperienced, totally inappropriately qualified. But at the same time, Ian and Ruth and I attended a 10-day training course in cardiovascular disease epidemiology run by the World Heart Federation, the American Heart Association, and we went to Blessington in Ireland. The most notable feature was when I was still trying to impress Ruth, I have to say, that I could sail, and we went out in this huge yacht and got tipped up and almost drowned in the middle of some bloody lake in Ireland. But we survived, and we had a wonderful time learning cardiovascular disease epidemiology from the likes of Henry Blackburn and Dick Remington and Jeffrey Rose in particular. So that was 1970, thereabouts. At the same time, Ian was having tremendous trouble with his clinical colleagues. What was he doing, taking time off from his clinical work, from his educational work, and travelling around the Pacific, travelling around New Zealand, studying populations? What possible good could that sort of work be? With the support of the Director General of Health at the time and the Dean of the Medical School, the Wellington Hospital Epidemiology Unit was established in 1970. And Ian was extricated from his educational responsibilities, from most of his medical responsibility, and was given a free hand, supported by the hospital board, to do full-time epidemiology. And the Tokelau study had started. It was interesting. It had started without any really serious theoretical engagement. It was an opportunistic study. In 1970, Ian convened a meeting in Wellington, brought from WHO, Ken Newell, perhaps known to some of you from Wellington, and John Castle, an epidemiologist from North Carolina, and two anthropologists, Tony Hooper and Anthony Huntsman, who from the University of Auckland, who had made Tokelau their field of endeavour. And they had a wonderful meeting and came up with a theoretical construct for the Tokelau Island migrant study, which progressed. So Ruth and I returned to Wellington, supported by the Medical Research Council in 1973, and I immediately began to get engaged with Ian's studies, doing longitudinal follow-ups of Cook Island Pukapukan populations and Maori populations. And then in 1976, we went back to Tokelau for 3 months Ruth had various responsibilities. Some of them, I should say, were domestic, but we took our 2 children, and I think that accounts for the fact that one of them is interested in public health and the other is not the slightest bit interested in public health. And my particular responsibilities were to measure blood pressure of all the children living in Tokelau and all the Tokelauan children living in New Zealand. What impact did migration to New Zealand have on children's blood pressure? And to our surprise, as far as we could tell, it had a very immediate impact. As soon as they arrived, they changed their diet, they changed their exercise patterns, weight went up, blood pressure went up. So that was very interesting. And then, having spent already some time in North Carolina, I went back again in 1976, and then when we came back to New Zealand, we went to Auckland, and that's been okay. Ian's move from clinical medicine to epidemiology was extremely stressful. And he says, openly, he was saying towards the end of his life, and I talked to his brother recently, that move brought out Ian's bipolar state. For some reason, it had been controlled while he was doing what he was used to doing, being a clinician. When he entered a new field, feeling under-equipped for the task, no training in epidemiology. Not very strong in mathematics, I hazard a guess. And he then suffered for the rest of his life from bipolar disorder. And that, when we were working for him, I don't think we understood what was going on. I don't think I was perhaps as sympathetic as I could have been in those days. He had all of this energy, drove us all crazy. And then there were periods that we didn't see of deep gloom. And it was a family secret until after a hospital admission, perhaps in the early 1980s, Ashburn Hall in Dunedin, when he began to talk about it openly. Way before other people in New Zealand, John Kirwan, for example, way before other people were talking openly about their mental health issues. But I come to believe that the energy he got from his bipolar disorder enabled him to take on all of these issues and to rope so many people into his fields of endeavour with such energy and such enthusiasm. So that's Ian. That's Ian and his medical work and his clinical work. I want to say, I believe that Ian's contribution to other aspects of social life in New Zealand are equally as important to his contributions to epidemiology and health policy. Ian made tremendous contributions in the field of the environment, in the field of peace studies, peace work, and in the field of arts and culture. And this may be a little parochial for Australians, but the story begins in Queenstown, 1970, about Ian's, Ellisby's great-grandfather had some beautiful property on the waterfront at Lake Queenstown, Lake Wakatipu in Queenstown, and a major chain wanted to build a hotel on the waterfront. Ian, of course, got outraged, and they were able to stop that. You might say that was not in my backyard type of project, but it led immediately to other projects. There was at Tiwai Point, out of Invercargill, an aluminium smelter being built, and they wanted to raise the lake of the level of Lake Waikari Moana by 28 feet to provide power to this foreign-owned aluminium smelter. Ian was outraged. He sent Ellisby to another lake, Lake Monowai, in the same region, which had been raised and reported on the devastation to the surrounding foreshore. Ian flew back to Wellington on Friday, met someone at the airport, Wellington Airport, said, "Charlie, we're going to lie outside the door of the Prime Minister's office on Monday to make sure this doesn't go ahead." Direct action was his immediate response. Apparently calmer heads prevailed, and they met instead on Monday morning at the Wellington Club. And they probably had a very nice lunch, but they got together and they organised and ran the Save Manapuri campaign, a very important environmental campaign in New Zealand, and perhaps the earliest successful campaign. Nick might add to that later. And it was only by being active politically that they won. The Holyoake government, the John Marshall government were supporting this development project. Norman Kirk in opposition said no, and it is said by some that this petition to save the lake was responsible, in part at least, for the change of government. And when the Kirk government came into power, they stopped the proposal. It came back later in 1991, and the campaign had to continue. And Ian established a coalition of environmental organisations called ECHO, which brought together the voices for improved environmental issues into one place. Strongly active in environmentals. Social justice and peace, this was dear to Ian's heart, perhaps because of his Methodist upbringing, who knows. And I mentioned International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Ian established the New Zealand branch of that organisation, the most successful branch in the world. 1/3 of all New Zealand doctors signed. Many of you in the audience, I'm sure, signed up and joined. And Nick, you were heavily involved in that. Russell Tregoning, who was here over the last few days, was heavily involved. Ian was the New Zealand secretary and heavily engaged in international affairs. And in some respects, that's been a very successful campaign. We haven't had a nuclear war yet. We haven't led to the abolition of nuclear weapons. That was also one of Ian's concern, Abolition 2000. Nick said yesterday that only one of the 10 nuclear armed countries has destroyed its arsenal, South Africa, so there's still a way to go. But that sort of engagement, I'm sure, was important in New Zealand legislation and our desire to be free of nuclear-armed and nuclear-power ships, which put us offside, of course, with Australia and perhaps more importantly with the United States for a long period of time. So there was that work. There was the engagement with the overstayers issues in the mid-1980s. Muldoon wanted to remove all the Pacific overstayers, particularly from Wellington, dawn raids and arresting of people and deporting, and Ian was outraged by that. So there was those many social issues that Ian was active in, supported by LSB. And then there was the arts and culture, and it's quite clear to me that this didn't come from Ian. All of this came from LSB. She came from a very cultured, refined, you might say, family, German origin. Her great-grandfather established Hallensteins and DIC trading companies in New Zealand. Very wealthy family. Her grandfather established the Willie Fells Trust, which funded a lot of Ian and LSB's social good activities over subsequent years. Ian initiated the Wellington Sculpture Trust, wonderful sculptures scattered around Wellington, the waterfront, botanical gardens, various other places. And he was a patron of the arts in his own way, in a very low-key way. Collected a wonderful set of New Zealand paintings. Many of them are now on display at the Art Gallery in Masterton, and some of his most precious paintings are in the National Art Gallery in Wellington. So Ian was an amazing person, inspiring, infuriating, energetic, enthusiastic. And I want to just turn to the last event of Ian's life, which was his funeral, 2009, late February. Ian's funeral was marked by a haka performed by members of the Black Power gang as he left the church, as he was taken away. And that funeral could only have occurred in New Zealand and probably could only have occurred for Ian. So that was Ian. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to introduce some novelty. I'm going to ask you to stand. And I'm going to, if we can have the slides now. And these are slides of, and you're standing for exercise, not as any mark of respect for... I should have made that clear. Do I do something? Yes, I do. Sorry. This is a wonderful book. This is a book that Ian wrote published in 2006, and it's called Ellisby and Ian, A Memoir of a Marriage. And this is Ian and Ellisby on their honeymoon. And there's lots of fascinating stuff in there. This is Ian in 1962 in Ruatahuna, interviewing. But he was much more than an interviewer and a measure of blood pressure, height and weight. He actually provided, you can sit down if you like, he provided medical services to all of the communities that he studied. This is Ian on the way to between the atolls to Nukunonu with the church in the background. The churches had all been destroyed in the 1940s by tremendous hurricanes. This is Ellisby in Tokelau in 1968, and these are our wonderful children. You've got two slides of the children, so bear with me. And this is Lake Monowai. It actually looks better on this picture than it should, but you can see around the foreshore some destruction. And this is Lake Manapuri, and this is a demonstration. And this is what it's all about, feeding the largest industrial establishment in New Zealand, owned by, well, it used to be owned by Australians, but I think it's now owned by an international company. And this issue, and of course the price of aluminium has fallen out of the ground, and this is no longer economic for anyone. And this is the albatross, familiar to everyone who lives in Wellington, one of the first sculptures on the waterfront, supported by the Wellington Sculpture Trust. And this is a painting, a Colin McCann painting, very famous New Zealand painter, and it's a letter to Hebrew. And Ian called it, you can perhaps just see it, you won't be able to see it up there. It says, what is faith? And this came out of a period of Great Depression Ian was suffering. He was travelling. He was reading the New Testament. He was writing notes to himself. He came across this New Testament quote. He asked Colin McCann to produce a painting, and he did. Turned out that they didn't have anywhere to hang it in their house in Waite Street, and he gave it to the National Art Gallery. A wonderful painting. And this is another painting. It's called Luncheon Under the Ash Tree. That's Ellisby and their three daughters. Painted by a woman called Eve Page out at Waikanae, north of Wellington. And Eve Page, for those of you who might be interested, also painted my mother. And I think that's the last slide. So I was going to keep track of the time, but I forgot to look at my watch. Ruth was giving me some... Oh my God. Maybe we won't have time for questions. You must have spoken for a long time, Robert, in your introduction. I wanted to say something now about epidemiology and policy. And epidemiology, public health and policy, actually. The basis of public policy, in my view, is values, ideology, and then perhaps third is evidence. And we've been very good on the evidence, as difficult as that been to collect evidence, which is useful for policymakers. We've been less successful in promoting an ideology of health equality, of social justice. We've abdicated our responsibility as epidemiologists, as public health people, from articulating a position from which we stand. We are so defensive. We are so reactive. We are so embarrassed that we actually want to do good. And we're so sensitive when we are called nanny statists, health Nazis, whatever the current phrases. And by the way, this is very current. Those of you who have been reading this week's BMJ and Martin McKean's top article on dirty politics, even the book Dirty Politics by Nikki Hager, there's a lot of undue and unpleasant influences on health academics, health policy people in New Zealand. So we don't take responsibility for what it is that we need to do. And in part, I think it's because we're not trained well in public policy. We tend to focus on the science that we know about, the epidemiology, the biostatistics. We don't engage enough, as Ian did, with people from other disciplines. Partly, I think it's also because we don't understand the policy-making process. And I want to talk about Jeremy Schiffman and the way he thinks about getting salience for health issues. And he was speaking and writing in The Lancet and elsewhere about global health issues, but I think it applies to New Zealand as well. And he talks, if you want to achieve salience, if you want to get on the political agenda, where we have to be, there are certain things that we need to think about. We have to think about the issue. We have to think about actor power. We have to think about the political context. And we have to be able to communicate our issues. Our issues are wonderful. They touch at the very heart and soul of people's health and well-being in New Zealand, but we perhaps don't articulate them well. And I'm going to contrast tobacco control with Boyd's topic. What is that, Boyd? Obesity, that's right. Tobacco, after 50 or 60 years, we've made some progress. I think we have begun to denormalise the industry. We have demonised the industry. They no longer have the authority, the power, in New Zealand at least, that they used to have. We're beginning to take control of the issue. We have a national goal, smoke-free Aotearoa 2025. Lots of issues, Richard, about how we're going to get there and whether we're on track. But it is a goal which has a lot of support, particularly from non-smokers, but in some situations also from smokers. And we speak with one voice on the whole with tobacco control. We're a little bit conflicted about e-cigarettes, but we'll deal with that. But in the obesity field, it's an absolute shambles. In the alcohol field, it's a shambles. Alcohol, the lack of progress made in alcohol control in New Zealand astounds me. The public wants, on the whole, alcohol control. They want the power of the industry to be curtailed. In obesity, we're totally conflicted. We don't know whether we know, but we don't articulate very well what the root cause of the problem is. We're still struggling with individual responsibility, with social determinants of overweight, particularly in children. So there are lots of issues around the issue. Actor power, I think again in New Zealand, that means the strengths of the voices supporting public health policies around tobacco. We're pretty strong. We're pretty strong. We have in New Zealand, as you used to have in Australia, we have ASH, which has been very active. We have the Smoke-Free Coalition. We have which brings together a lot of non-traditional health voices. Of course, the Medical Association has been very active, the Heart Foundation, Cancer and Asthma Society, but other groups, Salvation Army, Plunkett Society, they all support the New Zealand goal of being smoke-free by 2025. But in nutrition, we used to have the Obesity Action Coalition funded by the Ministry of Health, gone. I'm not sure that we have a single voice articulating a clear message. And if we don't have a single clear voice, the government is justified in ignoring us. The other critical issue about policy making is the political context. I guess it would be a bit of a competition between us in New Zealand and you in Australia as to see who is in the most hostile context for public policy. But, maybe there are some opportunities for both of us. And in the last period, we've made very strong progress on tobacco control, as you had under the Labour government, because of the unusual arrangement in New Zealand with the agreement between the Maori Party, a very small party, and the ruling, the majority National Party. And the context of that agreement was that the Maori Party would be able to advance its work on tobacco control. Well, in this recent election last month, We still have a Maori party, much diminished. We have a new Minister of Health, who I believe has more sympathy for public health than the previous Minister of Health. So maybe there are some opportunities, but we've lost our political champions. We no longer have the Associate Minister of Health in Parliament. We no longer have the Chair of the Health Select Committee in Parliament. So, there are some interesting obstacles ahead of us in promoting tobacco control, but perhaps also issues around childhood obesity and so forth. But I'm actually optimistic, and I know that I've survived in epidemiology and public health for so long because of my optimism. I mean, if you weren't optimistic, why would you keep doing this work? And I'm optimistic that in this environment in New Zealand, can't speak for Australia, certainly can't speak for Vietnam. I'm not sure what the political opportunities are. But I think there are certain things that we need to be thinking about. We need to engage politically. And Ian was very clear about that. He said, of course we have to engage politically. And of course you get a bad name. He was said to be a difficult bugger because of his work on saving Manapuri. But he engaged politically, he used his networks, he supported other people, he indeed was supported by many other people. Political engagement, networks of support. And I think it's very important that we speak in New Zealand, perhaps in Australia, with a strong, independent, authoritative voice. Preferably with a single voice, preferably on a set of simple priorities, without trying to do everything at once. And I think Ian would have agreed for that. In the last couple of minutes, I want to think about Ian in retrospect and say to you how I would sum up his life. I think, firstly, he wouldn't have achieved half as much as he had achieved if he'd tried to do it alone. He was supported at the family level, and he was able, perhaps through his enormous energy, to bring networks together and to do much of the work for him. So I think that's absolutely important for all of us. In terms of his life, I'm thinking about Viktor Frankl and his work on the meaning of life. That the three pillars of meaning for life are spirituality, are freedom, and a choice. And by spirituality, I think we can mean engagement in our work life with issues of critical importance. And I think it's without clear that Ian's life had much meaning. He was spiritually engaged. He acted with freedom, he acted with independence, and he acted responsibility. And I would say about Ian that he made a difference to life in New Zealand and further afield. He got things done. And I would say to us that if we follow his example, we can do the same. We can make a difference. Thank you. And we're going to sing a song which we think that Ian would have liked. It's a simple song. Robert has volunteered to hum along. Ruth is going... Are you coming, Ruth? Okay, we're going to sing Te Aroha. Te Aroha, Te Araho, Te Maria, Ta-ta, ta-ta. I think if we improvised a bit there, Ian would appreciate that. And that means peace and faith and love be amongst us all. And Ian would wish that for all of us. Thank you.
It's up to you. I don't see how we can have questions after that.
I can finish my
That's right. That is the most amazing Ian peroration that I've ever heard. And I've heard a few, but not all of them, obviously, so I may not be correct. But as I mentioned in my introduction, that no one knew Ian better than Robert. And we thank you for being so open about your experiences with Ian, and also sharing about Ian's life. And many of us obviously were not aware of the full story of Ian's life and the achievements that he made. And I'm sure that everybody here today, whenever you go to a future Ian peroration, this one here will be in the back of your mind, and it will be the benchmark that you use to judge future orations by. So thank you again very much. Okay, well, housekeeping.
I forgot something.
Yes, yes.
No, I mean, that's the trouble of not using slides and not having notes. It's this issue of independent voice for public health, and an independent authoritative voice for public health. And it's come up in New Zealand recently over some issues around conflict of interest, where there's been a woman who's been working for the Food and Grocery Council, advocating products that we would think to be not as healthy as they could be, and at the same time being on the board of the Health Promotion Agency, the government agency responsible for promoting health, and at the same time undermining academics by running campaigns through a rather vicious blogger. So this issue has been discussed at this meeting, and so what do we in public health do? And so we need, I think, an independent voice. Thank you for the question, Ruth. We need an independent voice for public health. And we have attempted in the past, we have established something called the Ian and Alice B. Prior Centre for Health and Wellbeing. And it seems to me, and for various reasons, George Salmon was running that, and he got sidetracked by a couple of issues, and I've been sidetracked, and Ruth has been sidetracked. It seems to me there might be an opportunity for us in New Zealand, thank you, Ruth, again, for reinvigorating a centre which would be independently funded to a very small amount, but have spokespeople able and willing to engage in public debates and begin to be proactive about these public debates, so that we're not always reacting, as we are, for example, with this conflict of interest statement. So if anyone's interested in that idea and wants to get involved, you could be in touch with me or Ruth. Thank you.
Okay. Oops. Okay, well, look, I think that's it. We've agreed there won't be any questions. And so I want to thank you again, Robert. That's the end of the proceedings, formal proceedings for today. And we have the dinner tonight, remember, and look forward to catching all of you tomorrow. So thank you.